All right,
We're good to go?
we got 14 votes on the floor.
All right, so what we're doing here is, if you agree with all three, that we should move forward with all three of these alignments, then obviously you push A. To agree with us, you'll say yes. If you like them all, except you do not like S1, then you push B. If you dislike S1 and S2, you can push B and C. So basically, you just vote for what if you like them all, or if there's one or two that you dislike. And then if you think there's another that should be added, then you push E.
Explain if you vote on if you vote on C, no S2, it means yes on everything except S2?
That's correct. You would be voting for S1 and S4.
Yeah.
So is S4 we're assuming the amendments that Blair suggested?
The adjustment.
Yes.
Yes,
We're missing
13.
one.
Got one more, no? I
One
got two.
more.
I got 14.
There we go.
There we go.
Awesome. Okay. So no S1, got the NSF. Okay. Okay, so we've got a majority on yes for those. I don't know if anybody I know this is anonymous because you're using this, but if there's anybody who feels that, that did vote no either on S1 or S2, if you want to just kind of talk a little bit about what your concerns are so that we know as we move forward. Otherwise, if you want to remain anonymous, we will respect that as well.
I guess I would have a question not about
Sure.
How do we vote on A through E, rather what it feels like the stated objective is. In other words, it feels like the stated objective is, in the process you just walked through, how do we use a rail line to gather or capture the greatest economic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. How do we use a rail line? So you start off with that being the objective. An alternative path for assessing this could be, how do we use the existing rail line? You could say first, what is the cost of that per mile versus creating new rail line? But how do we use the BNSF? At what cost? How do we use BNSF and then augment that with other medians to ensure we capture the same 1, 2, 3, 4 economic, passenger concentration,
Right.
et cetera, that you would under the other route?
Right.
And so it's a different way of going about, in other words, the objective is to capture the same number of people and the same level of activity,
Yes.
but you attempt to do it, I think, with more than one mode and at a lower cost.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense the way I'm saying.
Yes, it definitely does. And again, that's kind of, as we move into that next phase, that's where you're starting to, one, compare the different modes, but also looking at how much can you actually capture by implementing a bus network. That's where the modeling exercise comes in, because then you can attempt to try different variations and really pull in more than just the initial phase, which is here's an alignment, here's everything within a half mile, and you kind of have 7 different alignments and you're trying different things from that data standpoint, as I mentioned. When we get into that next phase, we're doing a lot more fine tweaking, if you will, and really getting into, once you have the mode, you can come up with the cost, and you can start to do cost benefit, trade-offs, and making sure that you're, one, capturing the most people to use the transit service, as well as, two, trying to come up with the best cost for that. And then really, it's coming back to you all and the public and saying, okay, we can give you the least cost alternative that gets you pretty good. We can give you the high cost alternative that gets you pretty good, or we can give you a medium, cost alternative that gets you really good. And we'll lay those out, and then, sometimes people want the most expensive or the least expensive. And then that choice is really outside of our hands and in you all's hands and the public's hands to really make a decision and move forward with. So it's kind of a long way to try and answer what you're asking. But really, once we have that mode, then we start to do that really detailed modeling and analysis to kind of come up with those trade-offs between cost and service. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Feels like there are additional things we could be considering. One, so I think the process you're going through may yield the same result, or at least the same analysis and ability to decide with the right information. On the other hand, both from a public resource standpoint and from a public relations standpoint, I mean, I think it makes sense to go through these various processes. But if you were to tell us, look, by using BNSF, you spend, I'm just using these figures, $1 million a mile. But by going the other route and building route, you're going to spend $6 million a mile. And with the differential, with either, we could put together a plan to capture the same population and the same usage. If that were the assumption, or if that assumption were true, could narrow the discussion a lot.
Right, yeah, and that's where we'll be on the next round. That's where we'll be able to hone in better for you on if we were able, like using your example.
Yep.
If we were able to capture the same potential economic development, the same ridership with half the cost. We'll be able to show you those statistics for a decision.
It'd be interesting also to add at the same time then, if you achieved what you just described, and by running a bus east and west across this, you not only could capture the territory, the people around the rail, but you could run the bus 10 miles east and 10 miles west.
Right.
To a certain extent, but yeah.
Well, do you suddenly explode the engagement that you're capturing and provide service to people that you wouldn't be providing otherwise?
I mean, each of these, I mean, when you look at the regional map, I mean, these corridors are really kind of designed at just long haul type of trip. So if we were to use a BNSF corridor, and presumably you put some sort of commuter rail on that, that is really a suburban style of transit. And people typically drive to one of those stations and use it to get into downtown.
Right.
You would feed it with bus as well, but if you get too far east and west of that corridor, then you're really adding on travel time. And so people won't use it if they've got 25 minutes on a bus and then 35 minutes on train to get into downtown. So we have to find that balance. The second purpose is, intra-corridor trips. So are there people going from Moore to Norman, or Norman to Moore, or Moore, to the different station locations? So we have to balance this long haul purpose with the possibility of some intra-regional, intra-corridor trips. So that brings in other modes and tighter station spacing. So when we get into the modeling, we're gonna model. The model doesn't care about mode. The model cares about travel times and access points. And then what the population and employment is around those access points. And so we will tailor these alternatives to emulate the modes by looking at different station spacing, by putting different speeds between those stations. And that will help us discern which mode. And then the model spits out a ridership. And if we get a ridership that a bus technology doesn't handle, then we know we got to go to a rail technology. So there's a little bit of an iterative process to go back and forth with a model to determine what kind of mode, truly what mode is going to work in this alignment with these characteristics. So there's a lot left to do at this point. I think this process is really designed to eliminate outliers. So we're not burning up the model with all these alternatives we know won't work. But we got to do that in a transparent process, so that when we go to the public, we're gonna have to show them all these alignments. Right. So that we don't get to the end of this process, we have an LPA, and somebody comes out of the woodwork and says, "Why did you consider this?"
Right.
All
move over to the east alignment, and Andrea's gonna talk us through that.
My mom is will gladly thank you for choosing only 3 alignments per corridor. I would like to just quickly point out some of the activity centers we have in the east corridor. As you all know, we have the OU Health Science Center that will be passed by 2 of the proposed alternatives. Midwest City Regional Medical Center. Of course, we have commercial corridors along the 29, I-40. We have the Midwest City Town Center, and then Tinker, our other end of the corridor. So keep those in mind as we're talking about the different evaluations of the routes. What I would like to point out to you is that we have 3 routes that have either all rail corridor or a rail corridor component. And those would, of course, be our E1, which is the entire UP line all the way from downtown Oklahoma City to Tinker Air Force Base. E2, it uses a portion east of Sunny Lane. It would hop onto the rail corridor that is currently abandoned. And E5, that route would do the same. So starting at Sunny Lane, going east, it would use the rail corridor instead of roadway. With that said, we looked at the different activity centers, we looked at the mobility populations, we looked at existing and future population and employment centers. We looked at several other characteristics, and here's how this shook out. I know Brian alluded to it earlier. The rail corridor for the east corridor did not work out well. It does not touch upon any of the activity centers. It just kind of skirts around all of them, with the exception of ending up close to Tinker Air Force Base, but that's it. Oklahoma City downtown and Tinker Air Force Base and nothing in between. So it performed very poorly in terms of activity centers, in terms of population and employment access, and this is what you can clearly see in the final results. Our E2 corridor, which is on Reno and then jumping onto rail. Reno for a large stretch east of downtown Oklahoma City is industrial, low on population, low on employment otherwise. There are no significant plans at this point in time for redevelopment, so again, this corridor did not perform very well. E3, Reno to Martin Luther King, then jumping onto I-40 and then down to 29th, South 29th. Again, we're missing a lot of the activity centers, and therefore this corridor did not perform very well either. We're starting to get a little more positive with our E4 corridor. I know, it was a little depressing to see the results shake out. This would be our stair-step approach, where we're starting on Reno, going down on Sooner, making another jog. So we're trying to capture some of the commercial and some of the residential areas, ultimately ending up on South 29th with the Midwest Town Center. But in relationship to our E5 and E6 corridor that touch upon the OU Health Science Center, even that corridor did not perform as well. So after looking at all of those combined characteristics, the only corridors that performed well are the ones that tie in the OU Health Science Center, take 10th into account where we have a large amount of limited mobility populations, and then make their way to Midwest City, end up at Tinker Air Force Base. But yeah, OU Health Science Center is really the large driver. And then what elevated E6, alternative E6, was passing by the Midwest Regional Medical Center as well. So the numbers were the evaluation overall was fairly easy for this corridor, but it was unexpected to see that the rail corridor shook out that poorly. And with that said, as you can imagine, we would like to recommend that only E5 and E6 would be moved forward into a more detailed evaluation. At this point, I'd be happy to receive any feedback.
The difference between E5 and E6, is it just Midwest City Hospital's the big thing missing from E5 that you get with E6?
That is correct.
Is it possible to modify E3 so that it goes up 35 to the 10th Street, 8th Street OU Medical Center. Just,
We have-
mainly the reason I ask is thinking about, transit type. I mean, otherwise, I guess I'm not sure where we're left if we have the hybrid route. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense or not. I just wonder how, it seems that OU Medical Center could have can it take it from a negative to a solid positive just by changing
It
that
would
piece?
have that, yes, it does. The problem is if you take it up to the OU Medical Center and then hop on 35 trying to get back down to I-40, it creates a much longer route, which would then not shake up very well with travel times. And we were concerned about, even with the stair-step route, ultimately, it's a longer route, it will take people longer. Most people at that point will decide, I don't want to take this is taking me too long. So unless, and I can't think of.
E3 does that?
If you try to take E3 up to OU Health Science Center and then trying to get back down, E3 is the one that runs on I-40.
Yeah.
I can't picture of any good way trying to get from.
My point was that it's more or less doing the exact same thing as purple E5. It's just, it gives you flexibility on the type of transit you use.
Oh.
Well, I mean, I think the fact that this rail corridor is abandoned opens up the possibilities for both rail and BRT.
Okay.
And so I think we can accomplish the same long haul that is it E5?
Yes.
E5 does on I-40?
E3.
E3 does on I-40 with, a fairly high-speed bus alternative along the abandoned rail line. And then we were thinking about it from a modal perspective. What you might do is have two different patterns for the buses. And so you might have what we'd call a local or limited stop that would go up north and serve the hospital area. And then you might have an express that would use Reno and come in straight into downtown. So that really would be pretty good service plan for Midwest City and really accomplish both our goals of the long haul as well as the intra corridor trips.
The economic development value would be very high, simply because most of
Doing
that has
something
got
on-
World War II housing,
Right, and doing that on the corridor down the.
and there's already a lot of excitement
And
of tearing all that housing out
And we have
because
periods-
of this corridor.
And we have periods of the day when 40's got quite a bit of traffic, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so,
Yeah, absolutely, and it will create, I think, more economic development with that corridor.
so my portion of the presentation is getting significantly shorter now.
Doing all your talking.
So,
Okay.
maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can get out of here when the mayor wants us to get out of here. So.
One of the things that we were advised by the work group, the East Corridor work group, was preservation of the rail corridor. Now, the portion of the rail corridor west of Sunny Lane is in current use, but the portion east of Sunny Lane, if an alternative like the one that is proposed could take advantage of the corridor and preserve it in that fashion for rail later on, that would be an awesome thing to do.
Well, even with what's going on at Tinker Air Force Base with the budgets,
Yeah.
it's one of those things we've all talked about. Nobody wants to give their car up here. And just the budget constraints, when the Hiroski Gate closed, the traffic was horrible out there around Air Depot and up on the interstate. I mean, it was horrible. And I think this will help alleviate a lot of those traffic congestions, because I believe that we are going to see more people take the transit.
And we won't
When that's
dismiss a
available.
rail option here either. I think
Yeah.
streetcar makes some sense because, it can operate on street, up here in the northern portion. And then
Absolutely.
depending on what sort of station configuration we use on the abandoned corridor, it can really operate like a light rail. I mean, those vehicles can do 55 miles an hour just like light rail. So, and they're smaller, so you don't need the capacity that
Mhm.
light rail has. So we'll run that option.
So unless there are
Can I
any-
ask, why, can you explain what the downside of E1? I understand it's west of Sunny Lane and it's being used. Are there other factors that I'm not familiar with?
There are, it does not touch upon most of the activity centers that are within the corridor. It connects downtown Oklahoma City and Tinker Air Force Base, and those are really the only two activity centers that this rail corridor directly connects to. Everything else is outside of the, we're talking about the 1.5 mile radius, and unfortunately, all of the activity centers that were identified for this east corridor fall outside of that radius. So it has some access to commercial on Sooner and on Air Depot, but it is very limited in comparison. It was the relative comparison to the other alternatives that were identified.
So Andreas, basically, it's this section right here, it doesn't provide any value
That is correct.
right there.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's really industrial.
Yeah.
It is.
Just to build though on the question, but ultimately, if we chose a heavy rail-based system on the south leg, one of the things that this doesn't seem to be incorporating is the potential for a through connection that's on a consistent mode, that doesn't require a changeover in mode. So, I don't know how that thinking gets incorporated, but it's currently being missed.
That turn is really difficult. If you're gonna do east-west or east to west, or, I'm sorry, north to west or south to west, that could be a really hard turn. It might make more sense to interline north and south, just because that track's already there.
Understood.
So
I
it's
mean,
hard to
the-
get west.
I guess
sorry,
my,
east into that.
but it's not captured, I mean, it clearly can go from north to east based on the move that's shown.
Not with hitting the downtown transit hub. And that's north of the hub considerably.
Okay.
We've been reserving, my understanding is we've been reserving space for a south to east turn through the middle of downtown Oklahoma City, because that was part of one of the variables that was included in the discussion about sites for the new convention center. Anyway, regardless, I guess the point stands that these are looking at these arms of the overall system discreetly, and it doesn't realize the potential for a connection.
Yeah, that was my biggest concern too, Blair, is that, we're looking at these individual, these corridors, and we're not looking at the synergy that's played out amongst all three of them in the system. And I think that what you're suggesting, that consistency of mode is not necessarily there. And I would suggest that the ridership numbers would look stronger if this corridor was in combination with the other two.
Well, and that's also part of the later presentation, but that's okay. When we model all these alternatives, we will put something in the other corridors. We haven't exactly figured out what will happen in those other corridors yet, or what that alternative will look like, but we will do some sensitivity testing on some of these through movements. So from an operational perspective, it's a little bit more intuitive to do the north-south connection and maybe east-west. But the issue is that UP line comes into the north, so it's going to be really difficult to do a little notch down to the transit center and then try to get back up to the corridor and keep going. So there's other options. So I think if that connectivity is that important, then we should probably pull S1, E1. I feel like I'm playing battleship.
Keeps us under our 3 cap, right? So.
Yeah, no, I don't think we have any issues with bringing it back. And we would only look at commuter rail.
There's a lot of people in the transit community that are assuming that some kind of connectivity would be based on that connection, on that southern core through to the North Bricktown parking lot. So I would caution you to just automatically ruling that out.
Okay.
And that's been part of planning for a long time.
Okay.
I think it'll save complaints later to have it fully analyzed.
I agree.
I think
So
it needs to be.
that will direct your voting.
I understand the objections, I understand the engineering issues and all that, the connectivity, but the overall connectivity needs it in there. Somebody wants to go from there to Edmond or there to Norman.
Certainly,
to have that.
certainly all of the east alternatives have to end at the hub, so that's going to be a challenge for designing it anyway. So I don't think it's any issue with bringing it back, but I mean, does the committee agree that we should really only look at a commuter rail option for that? I don't know if we're gonna.
For which?
UP line gets, for the UP
For
line
the
in its
park.
entirety.
Yeah, where UP
For the
crosses over.
Because I don't think we have any right of way to do something other than a heavy rail alternative.
Right.
No, I agree.
Okay,
Okay.
that's fine. It's like a negotiation. Salt talks.
Well, in that case, our no add other would then be keeping E1 in.
Approve the two you already have, plus adding, one would be a D vote.
Correct.
Correct.
Somebody's holding out.
It's a different type of integrated, yeah, streetcar integrated streetcar system. I mean, ultimately,
Yeah, one more.
I wonder if people like, there could be a tinker to the future. And once it, which is
Going one?
Has everybody had a chance to vote?
everybody had a chance.
We got one holdout. There we go.
There we go, we got it.
Oh, we got it. All right, I think we heard that loud and clear. All right, so we'll be adding back in E1, which I think is a really good point. And that was one of the big ones we knew we were gonna have a good discussion about, so thank you for your honest feedback on that one. So we'll be adding it back in, and we'll be looking for ways to do the connection down, as well as making sure we're not precluding any future connections north, as well as to the south. So, perfect. All right, let's move on to the next one.
We're tipping it sideways, it's a long corridor.